In the spring of 1864, during the Civil War, a small printing shop opened in Chicago and eventually became R. Donnelley, one of the largest printing companies in the world. For 150 years, the company printed textbooks, magazines, financial statements, and prospectuses that powered American capitalism. If you bought shares in a company during the 20th century, R. Donnelley likely printed the documents describing that investment. At its peak, the company employed tens of thousands of workers, with the Chicago plant serving as the crown jewel of American industrial manufacturing, where massive machines hummed constantly and skilled workers operated with precision and pride. The company's success was built on something tangible: the ability to transform paper and ink into products people needed. This was industrial capitalism in its purest form, where physical production created value and a company's worth was directly connected to what it could manufacture and sell. Workers took pride in their craftsmanship, understanding that the books and materials they printed would educate children, inform readers, and serve critical business functions across the nation. Generations of families worked at R. Donnelley, passing down skills and knowledge from parents to children, creating a stable middle class in Chicago that supported entire neighborhoods and communities. The company became a symbol of American industrial strength and worker stability during the 20th century, representing everything that seemed permanent and reliable about American capitalism. But by the early 21st century, something fundamental had changed. The internet arrived faster than predicted, digital publishing emerged as a real alternative to print, and suddenly the assumptions guiding R. Donnelley for over a century began to crumble. Books were still published, but fewer required paper. Magazines moved online. Financial statements that once required thousands of pages could now be delivered as PDF files instantly. Print demand declined steadily, and once comfortable margins began to shrink. Instead of accepting this new reality and adapting gradually, the leadership of R. Donnelley made a fateful decision. Rather than closing underutilized facilities in phases workers could adjust to, the company's executives decided to pursue financial engineering, a set of complex strategies designed not to improve the actual business but to make it look more attractive to investors and create the appearance of value where the underlying business was actually declining. To understand this strategy, imagine a family business earning $100 monthly with $90 in expenses, leaving only $10 in profit. Most families would accept thin margins and work to improve them by cutting costs or finding new customers. But imagine instead that this family borrowed $300. Why would they do this when the business was barely profitable? The borrowed money could reorganize the company to look more valuable on paper, even if the underlying business was actually getting weaker. The money could spin off divisions, creating multiple smaller companies out of one larger one. These newly created companies would have higher stock valuations because investors love focused, specialized businesses. Executives and shareholders could make enormous profits on paper, at least temporarily. Wall Street analysts would praise the strategic moves and bold restructuring. Business magazines would feature visionary leadership that had unlocked shareholder value. But there was a fundamental problem with this entire approach, a problem so basic that anyone understanding finance should have seen it. When a company borrows money, it must be repaid with interest, and interest payments do not shrink when the company's revenue declines. If a printing company borrows hundreds of millions to restructure, those interest payments remain the same whether it prints 10 million books yearly or 1 million. But as digital publishing grew and print contracts declined, the revenue of spun-off Donnelley companies fell faster and faster, while debt remained fixed and immovable. The mathematics of the situation looked increasingly grim. Graphs showing revenue trends slid downward year after year. Graphs showing debt ratios and interest payments as revenue percentages shot upward. The company's leadership began receiving warnings from financial advisors, but by that point, the restructuring was already underway and too late to reverse without admitting failure. Then, as if to worsen matters, unexpected disruptions hit the global supply chain. Paper prices, relatively stable for decades, suddenly spiked. Contracts the company had counted on disappeared as customers went bankrupt or shifted business to digital competitors. The carefully constructed financial model guiding executive strategy stopped working. Supply chain disruptions lasted longer than anyone anticipated, creating cascading problems throughout the entire printing industry. By the 2020s, pressure became overwhelming. Credit rating agencies, which assess company debt riskiness, began downgrading Donnelley's ratings. Investors started worrying about whether the company could repay what it borrowed. Banks became reluctant to offer new loans, a process called refinancing, often necessary for companies carrying large debts. The company's executives realized they faced an impossible situation. They could not cut their way out because the business was not shrinking gradually, it was contracting rapidly. They could not grow out of it because the fundamental market for printed materials was disappearing. The only solution left was massive restructuring, closing facilities and eliminating jobs at a scale that shocked communities relying on these businesses. In Chicago's plant, which had been a beacon of American industrial manufacturing for generations, the company announced massive layoffs. 5,000 workers received layoff notices. The presses fell silent. The conveyor belts, which had moved continuously for decades, stopped. Union workers, many having devoted entire careers to the company, walked out carrying boxes of personal items. Some workers had been with the company for 30, 40, or even 50 years, never imagining they would face unemployment at this stage of their lives. Many of these workers had mortgages they believed would be paid off by retirement, college funds they had carefully saved for their children, and dreams of comfortable retirements that vanished overnight. Some families lost health insurance coverage immediately, creating medical emergencies and financial crises. For over a century, capital had built R. Donnelley into an industrial powerhouse. In just months, that same capital-driven system dismantled it completely. The question naturally arising is why no one stopped this, why there were no regulations preventing a company employing tens of thousands from being destroyed by financial engineering. The question of corporate accountability in America became urgent and visible through this collapse, prompting serious discussions about the role of government oversight in protecting workers and communities. The answer lies in understanding how modern markets work and what they reward. Markets strongly reward short-term returns on investment. If a strategy makes stock prices rise this year, it is considered successful, even if that same strategy causes company collapse in 5 years. Spinning off divisions and taking on debt boosts share prices temporarily because investors get excited about focused companies and higher return promises. Because short-term gains happen immediately while long-term costs arrive later, executives have every incentive pursuing these strategies. By collapse time, those executives have often sold stock and moved elsewhere. Debt amplifies profits when times are good but also amplifies collapse when times turn bad. When leveraged companies face financial distress, creditors, banks, and financial institutions that lend money have legal claims coming before workers and communities. This means when R. Donnelley needed drastic cost cuts, workers lost jobs and benefits while the company prioritized repaying creditors. Workers absorbed the full shock of financial distress while lenders and shareholders were protected by bankruptcy law and debt reorganization structures. When the R. Donnelley printing empire collapsed, effects rippled outward, affecting far more than the company and workers. The printing industry had to absorb work previously handled by Donnelley's massive facilities. Smaller printing companies, which competed with Donnelley but were never large enough for biggest contracts, suddenly had to expand rapidly, serving customers who lost their primary vendor. Some succeeded, others found themselves unable, handling sudden demand increases or investing in new equipment needed to serve customers at expected levels. Publishing became more concentrated, with fewer large players controlling markets. This reduced competition and gave remaining printers more power, raising prices, making it more expensive for publishers and authors to print books. Meanwhile, 5,000 workers faced immediate devastating consequences unrelated to graphs, financial ratios, or capital structures. These workers had mortgages to pay, they had children in college or preparing to attend, with tuition looming. They had health care needs and prescriptions requiring insurance coverage. They had accumulated skills and experience in printing, but those skills were worth less as the industry contracted. Many were in their 50s or 60s, old enough that finding jobs at comparable wages would be extremely difficult, but not yet old enough to retire. For these workers, R. Donnelley's collapse was not an abstract financial story. It was personal catastrophe affecting their ability to provide for families and maintain dignity. Chicago's industrial backbone, having made the city famous and powerful throughout the 20th century, weakened further. The city had already lost steel mills, automobile factories, and countless other manufacturing businesses to automation, outsourcing, and changing conditions. R. Donnelley's loss was another blow to a region that had once been America's manufacturing capital. The broader R. Donnelley story is not really just a printing story. It is a story about how modern capital allocation works, about who bears risks when financial strategies fail, and about what happens when financial engineering becomes more important than actual business fundamentals. It is a story repeating itself across the American economy. Look at what is happening in 2024 and 2025. Private equity firms are acquiring companies at record rates, using debt financing these acquisitions. They restructure companies to look more profitable on paper, extracting value paid out as investor dividends. Leverage buyouts, where investors use mostly borrowed money buying companies, have become standard practice. Corporate spin-offs, where large companies break into smaller pieces, are common strategic moves. The formula is consistent: acquire companies with debt, extract value through various financial techniques, optimize for short-term shareholder returns. Hope growth eventually outruns interest payments. Sometimes this strategy works. When underlying business is strong and markets are growing, companies can service debt and create genuine value. But when underlying business is weak or declining, when markets turn down, or when unexpected disruptions occur, strategy fails catastrophically. When leverage buyouts fail, capital survives collapse. Private equity firms walk away with extracted profits. Lenders get repaid through bankruptcy proceedings, but labor absorbs full shock. Workers lose jobs, wages, and benefits. Communities lose tax revenue and economic activity. Entire downside risk is borne by workers and communities depending on these companies. The R. Donnelley story is not unique. It is one example among thousands of similar stories playing out across American industries. Legacy industries, printing, retail, manufacturing, energy all deal with digital disruption, changing markets, and debt-fueled restructuring consequences. Some will successfully adapt. Others will follow R. Donnelley's path, becoming hollow shells stripped of value before disappearing. The larger question economists and policymakers should ask is what happens when debt-driven restructuring continues and an economic recession arrives. Economic recessions are inevitable, happening roughly every 7 to 10 years in modern capitalist economies. When recession arrives, companies carrying high debt face extreme pressure. They must cut costs drastically. Banks become unwilling refinancing debt. Credit freezes, layoffs accelerate. In the last major recession in 2008, the financial system nearly collapsed because mortgage industry debt had accumulated so much that one sector's failure threatened entire economy collapse. American corporate debt is now higher than 2008, and much was taken on specifically funding leverage buyouts and corporate restructuring. If significant recession occurs while this debt is outstanding, consequences could be severe, not just for individual companies but for entire regions and industries. Economists warn that the current debt levels could trigger a cascade of corporate failures that would dwarf even the 2008 financial crisis in their impact on working Americans and their communities. The question emerging from R. Donnelley and hundreds of similar stories across America is simple but profound. If debt-driven restructuring continues, if more companies are broken apart and leveraged for short-term gains, if risks are consistently transferred from capital to labor, what happens when inevitable recession comes? Who carries risk when multiple large companies fail simultaneously? And who gets paid first when creditors demand money back? The answer to that last question is always the same. Capital gets paid first, workers and communities get paid last, if at all. One company, one city, 5,000 workers. This was R. Donnelley's story in the 2020s, but it is also dozens of other companies' story in dozens of other cities, affecting hundreds of thousands of workers. It was not really about books disappearing, though books did disappear from that factory. It was about how modern financial systems work, about capital's power to reshape entire industries, and about how that power can benefit small investor numbers while imposing massive costs on workers and communities. Understanding this story matters because it is still happening right now. The next R. Donnelley is probably being restructured right now somewhere in America. The next 5,000 workers are probably receiving layoff notices this quarter. And the question of who bears financial engineering costs and who reaps rewards remains as urgent and unanswered as ever. The story of R. Donnelley serves as a cautionary tale for what happens when financial systems prioritize wealth extraction over human welfare.